This painting was stolen by Nazis, trapped in a courtroom for 12 years, and fought over by two nations. It's worth tens of millions of dollars, but no one ever stopped to ask about the girl in the frame. Her name was Wally, and this is her story. Vienna, 1910. The city was electric, the capital of desire, the beating heart of European art and intellect. Gustav Klimt was painting golden goddesses. Sigmund Freud was mapping the unconscious. And in the cafes and studios of the city, a revolution was brewing. One that would strip art down to raw flesh and exposed nerve. At the center of that revolution was a 20-year-old dropout named Egon Schiele. Klimt himself had taken him under his wing. He called him the most talented artist of his generation. But where Klimt seduced with gold and ornament, Schiele attacked with bone and sinew. His figures were twisted, skeletal, disturbingly erotic. Vienna had never seen anything like him, and wasn't sure it wanted to. It was around this time that a girl entered Schiele's life. Her name was Walburga Neuzil. Everyone called her Wally. She was about 17. Very little is known about her origins. No record of her parents, no documentation of her education. What we do know is that she had likely been one of Klimt's models, and possibly his lover, before being passed along to his young protege. Wally became everything to Schiele. His model, his companion, his anchor in a world that increasingly wanted nothing to do with him. She moved in with him, unmarried, in 1912 Austria. And together they left Vienna for the small town of Nullenbach. They were looking for cheap rent and creative freedom. What they found instead was suspicion, hostility, and scandal. Schiele was drawing young girls from the neighborhood in explicit poses. Wally was living with him in open sin. The townspeople were horrified. And in April of 1912, the police came. Schiele was arrested. He was accused of seducing a 13-year-old girl. A charge eventually dropped, and of displaying obscene material where children could see it. He spent 24 days in jail. During the trial, the judge held one of his drawings over a candle flame and burned it, right there in the courtroom. Art, destroyed by the very institution meant to uphold civilization. And through all of it, Wally stayed. She visited him in prison, brought him food, oranges, clean clothes, art supplies. She was his lifeline. Schiele later wrote about those days. The loneliness, the humiliation, the cold. But he rarely wrote about the woman who made them bearable. That silence would come to define their entire story. It was during this turbulent year that Schiele painted the portrait of Wally. And it is unlike almost anything else he ever created. There are no twisted limbs here, no confrontational nudity. Just a young woman, her head tilted slightly, her red hair pulled back, her cheeks flushed, and her eyes. Those extraordinary eyes, looking sideways at the viewer with an expression impossible to fully read. Is it love? Weariness? Sadness? Knowing? Art historians have called it the most tender painting Schiele ever made. The only portrait where he seems to genuinely love his subject, not just observe her. In a career built on provocation, this painting is a quiet confession. For 3 more years, Wally and Egon lived together. She modeled for him, managed his affairs, kept his studio in order, endured the whispers. She gave him everything. And in 1915, he repaid her with betrayal. Across the street from his studio lived 2 sisters from a respectable family, Adele and Edith Harms. Schiele became infatuated with Edith. She was proper, well-bred, socially acceptable. Everything Wally was not. He decided to marry her. But here is the part that reveals the full measure of the man. Schiele didn't simply leave Wally. He proposed an arrangement. He would marry Edith for social standing and respectability, but he and Wally would remain lovers. They would take vacations together every summer. Nothing between them had to change, he said. Except, of course, everything. Wally said no. Wally said no. She refused to be kept in the shadows. She refused to be his secret. She walked away from the man she had stood beside through poverty, scandal, and imprisonment. And she never saw him again. What Wally did next has been pieced together from scattered records and fragments. She volunteered as a Red Cross nurse. She was deployed to the Balkans, to military hospitals filled with the shattered bodies of the First World War. She worked in Sinj, a small town in what is now Croatia. And there, on Christmas Day, 1917, Walburga Neuzil died of scarlet fever. She was 23 years old. She died alone, far from Vienna, far from the studios where she had been immortalized in paint. No one famous mourned her. No obituary was written. Less than a year later, Egon Schiele died of the Spanish flu. She was pregnant with their first child. 3 days after that, Egon Schiele himself was dead. He was 28. The flu took him just as the war was ending and his career was finally reaching its peak. In the span of 12 months, everyone in this story was gone. Wally, Edith, Egon. All that remained were the paintings. And Wally's portrait, those searching eyes, that flushed skin, was about to begin a journey far more turbulent than any of their lives. The portrait of Wally eventually came into the possession of a woman named Leopold, a Viennese art dealer and one of the very few women running a gallery in the 1920s. Lee didn't just own the painting. She loved it. She kept it not in her gallery but in her private apartment. It was personal to her. Then the world changed. March 12, 1938. German troops crossed the Austrian border. The Anschluss was complete within hours. Overnight, Austria's Jews lost everything. Their rights, their businesses, their safety, their art. Lee Bondi was Jewish, and she had something the Nazis wanted. A man named Friedrich Wells came to her apartment. He was an art dealer, an opportunist, and a member of the Nazi Party. He didn't need to threaten her with words. The threat was the uniform, the party pin, the New World Order standing in her doorway. He took the portrait of Wally. Lee Bondi fled to London with almost nothing. She would spend the rest of her life trying to get that painting back. After the war, the portrait surfaced in the Austrian Federal Monuments Office, part of a vast and chaotic pool of recovered and confiscated art. Lee reached out. She filed claims. She wrote letters. She begged. But the Austrian bureaucracy was slow, opaque, and profoundly uninterested in returning art to its Jewish owners. The painting slipped through the cracks. Or more accurately, it was pushed through them. And then it found a new owner. A man whose obsession would shape the next half-century of this story. His name was Rudolf Leopold. By profession, an ophthalmologist. By passion, perhaps the most relentless art collector of the 20th century. Leopold had one fixation above all others: Egon Schiele. He bought everything he could find, tracking down paintings in attics, estate sales, and back rooms of small-town galleries. Over the decades, he assembled more than 200 works by Schiele, the largest private collection in the world. Among them was the portrait of Wally. Leopold acquired it in the post-war years, under circumstances that remain murky at best. There is strong evidence he knew it had been taken from a Jewish collector. He bought it anyway. In 1994, the Austrian government purchased his entire collection. Over 5,000 works, for an estimated $160 million. A new museum was built in the heart of Vienna's Museumsquartier, the Leopold Museum. Rudolf Leopold was appointed its director for life, and the portrait of Wally hung on its walls as one of the crown jewels of the collection. Meanwhile, Lee Bondi had died in London in 1969. She never recovered her painting. She never saw justice. But her heirs had not forgotten. For decades, the portrait hung quietly in Vienna. Thousands of visitors passed by it every year, admiring that haunting sideways glance. No one would have guessed what was about to happen. Because one day, Wally's portrait crossed the Atlantic and walked straight into a trap. 1997. The Leopold Museum loaned the portrait of Wally to the Museum of Modern Art in New York for a major exhibition on Schiele. It was meant to be a celebration of Austrian expressionism on the world stage. It became something else entirely. And Robert Morgenthau, the legendary district attorney of Manhattan, a man whose own family had fled the Nazis, issued a subpoena. The painting was seized. It could not leave the United States. The Leopold Museum was outraged. The Austrian government protested. They called it a violation of international law, a breach of the sacred trust between museums. If any country could simply seize a loaned painting, they argued, no museum would ever lend anything again. The art world held its breath. And so began one of the longest and most emotionally charged legal battles in the history of art. 12 years, from 1998 to 2010. Lawyers, depositions, appeals, diplomatic cables. The case raised questions no court had ever fully answered. Who owns art stolen by the Nazis? What happens when it has changed hands multiple times? What obligation do museums have to investigate what they display? At the center of the storm stood Rudolf Leopold, defiant and unapologetic. He insisted he had purchased the painting legally. He refused to acknowledge the Bondi family's claim. He showed no remorse, no empathy, no willingness to compromise. To him, the painting belonged in Vienna, where Schiele's legacy could be properly honored. The suffering of one Jewish family was, in his calculation, secondary. Leopold became, in the eyes of many, the villain of this story. A man who had built a temple to beauty on a foundation of stolen grief. But time, as it always does, had the final word. Rudolf Leopold died on June 29, 2010. He was 85. He never gave the painting back. But just months after his death, the Leopold Museum Foundation reached a settlement. They paid $19 million to the heirs of Les Bondi Jurés. The Portrait of Wally returned to Vienna. It hangs in the Leopold Museum to this day. $19 million. That is the price the world placed on Wally's face. But let me tell you what $19 million cannot buy. It cannot buy back the years Les Bondi spent writing letters to an indifferent bureaucracy. It cannot undo the moment Friedrich Wells stood in her doorway. It cannot give Wally Neuzil a proper grave, because, to this day, no one knows exactly where she is buried. And it cannot return her to that Vienna studio, where a young man once painted her with something that might have been love, or might have just been the closest he ever came to it. The Portrait of Wally has been called the Austrian Mona Lisa, and, in many ways, it is. A small painting with an enigmatic expression, whose fame grew far beyond anything the artist imagined. But there is one crucial difference. We know who the Mona Lisa was. Lisa Gherardini, wife of a Florentine merchant. She has a name, a history, a place in the record. Wally Neuzil has almost none of that. No letters, no diary. No recorded words. Everything we know about her comes from the men who painted her, used her, and left her behind. 3 men define the fate of this portrait. Egon Schiele, who painted her and abandoned her. Friedrich Wells, who stole her image under the shadow of the swastika. And Rudolf Leopold, who refused to let go, even when justice demanded it. 3 men who, in their different ways, treated Wally, the painting and the person, as something to be owned. If you visit the Leopold Museum in Vienna today, you can see her. She's smaller than you'd expect, about 13 by 16 inches. The colors are muted but warm. And those eyes, Wally's eyes, still look sideways at you. As if she knows something you don't. As if she's been watching all along. She was a girl from nowhere who became the face of one of the 20th century's greatest painters. The victim of one of history's greatest crimes. And the subject of one of the art world's greatest legal battles. And after all of it, the love and the betrayal, the theft and the courtroom, the millions of dollars and the decades of silence, the world still doesn't really know who Wally was. Maybe that's the point. Maybe that's what her eyes are trying to tell us. That we've been looking at the painting for over 100 years. And we still haven't learned to see the woman. If this story moved you, subscribe to the Synthetic Oracle channel, and leave us your like and your comments. We bring forgotten stories back to life, because every painting has a voice if you're willing to listen.